Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, we're back on this Monday on the Investigative Journal. Glad you can join me. This is Greg Anthony, and it's, October 9th, 2017, and I believe it's a holiday in America. I'm not quite sure which one. I didn't even want to bother looking it up, but I think it's President's Day. So I thought today what we could do is go back and look at the formation of our country, how the Vatican was involved in it, and work our way to today, because I'll tell you, at no time in the history of this country is it more important to understand the Vatican and the Jesuit role in what's going on in the world today. And I've concentrated on that for over 12 years, and you can get a lot of my shows going back that far until today on October 9th at greganthonysjournal.wordpress.com. And like I said, go there, hit that donate button, because we're a listener-sponsored show. And without your help, we can't keep it going. And times have been lean lately. I know it is for a lot of people in this country. But if you want to be getting the truth and nothing but the truth, at least we attempt to hold no agendas here. There is no hidden agenda. It is basically we put the information out. And I remember years ago when I was on Genesis Communication Network as well as Republic Broadcasting Network, two of the larger internet stations at the time, I began doing a lot of shows on the Vatican and received a lot of flack from the managements of both companies, and of course Alex Jones, who is the kingpin of Genesis Radio. And my show was either before or after his for a while. And he basically used to just say, this guy is crazy, the Vatican, our old priests, they have no money. And I realized that these stations happened to be COINTEL operated as well. They didn't want this message out there. And you can go back to a lot of those shows that they deleted, especially Republic Broadcasting Network, took a lot of my work and just erased it. And the reason is, the show that I had then became very, very popular. And people didn't hear this 10 years ago. And they wanted to know more. And so we're still doing it on a smaller Christian station, one of the few stations that will allow this. And you should thank Nicholas over there for doing it, allowing this kind of show to be on the air, because we're delving into a subject that basically the powers that be want to keep it secret. That's why they have their secret societies and all of their stuff. They do not want you to break through what I call, the Vatican-led New World Order matrix. They don't want you to get to this point because they want you to stop at what they tell you. They want controlled robots, basically. They want good, obedient workers that do what they tell them. And basically, there's two sets of laws, one for the elite and one for the rest of us. It's a club. It's a big club, and you and me are not in it. And so you've heard that talk, the Illuminati, all of the bankers, and all of, it goes on and on. Where are these secrets of Skull and Bones, all the secret societies? But once you start peeling away that onion, you'll find deep down there is the Vatican at the head of it all. I've always said all roads, folks, lead to Rome. And that's one of the reasons why you see the Pope getting such attention, especially here in America when he came over and, on the taxpayers' dime, spoke to Congress. What is this all about? I thought it was, an independent, a separation of church and state. And then he spoke to the leaders of the world. He wasn't the representatives of the countries. All the leaders of the world came to the UN. And the Pope, who will occupy that 666 seat that's vacant in the United Nations, spoke to them as well. And it should give you a clue of what they're really all about. Now, what is going on in America? Why don't we look at it closely? You've noticed that there's been an assault with all of these, orchestrated weather events that they can control. And they can do much more than just control the weather. They have microwave and such weaponry now that they don't even need to use a gun. And once you see how devastating it can be, you'll understand that America's under attack that way. It's also under attack financially, and you'll also see it under attack with their orchestrated wars. Now, one of the first orchestrated wars was the American Revolutionary War, and I think it's a good time to go back, since it is, I think, President's Day. If it's not, there will be a President's Day someday. I think it's today. And I thought we'd go back and look at that portion of history because it's one of my favorite areas. And I started doing this years ago after I interviewed a guy by the name of Tupper Saucy, who passed away, I think, in 2008 or 2009. And Tupper was on my show several times, and I read through his book, Rulers of Evil. And in Rulers of Evil, he tried to look at the Revolutionary War from an angle that many people never thought about. And the reason they didn't think about it was because the Vatican and the Jesuits, according to Saucy and others, and I would have to say I'd get on that bandwagon myself after doing my own research, was that they covered it up themselves so that Lorenzo Ricci, the Jesuit general at the time, could actually come over here in a covert manner and help orchestrate the beginnings of this country after he had already planned how the American Revolution could actually begin and how he pitted England against France. And then he then slyly orchestrated the American Revolution for one reason. And the reason was not only to start this experiment of democracy or the republic, but also by creating a constitution that would allow Catholics to practice their religion here. Because back then, many of the Protestants that came to this country realized what the Vatican and the Jesuits were all about from their shenanigans in Europe, when they tried to overthrow Parliament, blow up Parliament in England, and all of the other countries they were kicked out of because of trying to control the destiny of the people there and the governments through every kind of deceit, treachery, blackmail, you name it. And so the people were quite aware when they came here, they didn't want the Jesuits here, and that's why there were very few Catholics. In fact, in the beginning, before our country was formed, they couldn't hold any type of town office or anything. So basically, Ricci's goal was to create this war, a smokescreen, so to speak, so that if you have a constitution that allows freedom of religion, guess who can sneak their way into this country and grow from one small diocese in Maryland, to the largest religion in this country. And you see it, and they're not really a religion, that's just a front for what they really are all about. If you understood their holdings, if you understood the power that they wield worldwide, that's why the Pope's the top of the food chain here, and that's why he's the head of the snake. And that's why you have to understand how they operate. Just think of it this way. You got a puppet, and then you got a puppet master. And the puppet master comes from Rome, and the Jesuits are basically there to make sure that the military operations, that the financial operations, that all of their plans, false flag terrorism that they've created now, is all working towards one goal, and that's a one world government and a one world religion. It boils down to that. So I thought, the area that I'm going to read something from a book called Code Word Babylon Danger in the Vatican by P.D. Stewart, The Revolutionary War, How America Became a Jesuit Enclave. And it's most colossal conspiracy against the U.S. I don't like the resurrection of the Jesuits, and that was former U.S. President John Adams in 1816. But if you look at history a little bit differently, let me tell you the point of history that you need to look at. And that was exactly when the Pope at the time in Rome had disbanded the Jesuits. And for all the world to know back then, and this came through to the colonies here in America at the time, the word on the street and the word in the newspapers was that the Jesuits are no longer a viable organization in the Catholic Church because of what they've done. In a sense, in Europe, they were kicked out of so many countries. And this, I think, is an orchestrated plan. And the Vatican basically said it had to cut ties with the Jesuits. So they said that they jailed. Now listen to this. Lorenzo Ricci, he's the kingpin guy you got to start researching. R-I-C-C, Ricci, I. Lorenzo Ricci, the Jesuit general, during the time and prior to the American Revolution and the formation of our country. Well, prior to 1776, he was supposedly jailed and died at Castel San Angelo, the prison in Rome next to the Vatican. And there were some strange things regarding that. Now, if you believe that the Jesuits were disbanded, and then miraculously they were reinstated by a pope in 1814 or 1815, or that period of time, then it kind of looks kind of strange. Why would they just kick them out and then bring them back in within, 40 years? And during that time, wasn't it interesting that the American Revolution took place? And also the U.S. Constitution was ratified. And what did it do? Outside of all, this experiment in democracy, etc. What did it do? It has a clause in there called freedom of religion, meaning that no matter what religion or non-religion that you practice in the United States, you can do it here, free of any torture or anything. Well, that's what they tell you. Now, what did it do? Well, at the time of our formation of our country, there was one small diocese here in Maryland, Catholic diocese. Because at the time, even prior to the formation of our country, Catholics could not hold office. They were basically persona non grata because of the actions of the Jesuits in Europe during the time. Remember when they tried to blow up Parliament and all the other countries they were kicked out of for trying to control the destinies of the foreign and domestic policies of these countries? And so when the Vatican and the Jesuits supposedly had their split and Lorenzo Ricci was jailed and died, it always struck me as weird that that happened that way. Now, you're going to get a lot of even the anti-Jesuit researchers who are going to buy that story hook, line, and sinker. But, it was interesting that Tupper didn't buy it, and he researched it a little deeper. And I began talking to him about it and started to research it myself. And I said, you got a point here. And there's a number of there was 2 or 3 books that even laid some factual information to what his theory was. And the theory basically is this, that Lorenzo Ricci never was jailed, really, and died in that jail cell. But he was then allowed to come over to the United States right during the time of the ratification of the Constitution, because all along he was called the professor when he came here. Now, the history books don't say that Lorenzo Ricci actually took a boat and met with Franklin and some of the founding fathers during this critical stage to open up the door for freedom of religion in our Constitution. But there are some facts that show that it's a strong, strong probability. And the reason being is that Ricci, behind the scenes, prior to his jailing, was instrumental in orchestrating how France and England would pit each other against each other in the New World and create what was called the the Boston Tea Party, and then the American Revolutionary War for a reason. And the reason was, one, they say in the books that, we're fighting England, but it wasn't really that simple. And Ricci's plan was brilliant. He was a brilliant researcher and the guy, when you've heard of the book Sun Tzu's Art of War, okay? Now, wasn't it interesting that just prior to this time, the Jesuits were the first to supposedly translate that Chinese general's book into French, and Ricci was right there. Now, many say, let's look back at a couple books. Now, we all know that Mein Kampf was not written by Adolf Hitler, but also by a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Stampfer. And so if we go one step further, what about Sun Tzu's Art of War? It's interesting the Jesuits, they say, first translated it. But when you go back to China, you got to understand the Jesuits were there, very instrumental in a lot of things going on in China. And when you try to recount who Sun Tzu was and all these things, there's a lot of sketchy things that the guy even existed. So is it a possibility that he actually wrote that book and used those strategies to move the Revolutionary War to a point where the Constitution and the new 13 colonies could be formed for a reason? Now, how could you do that? Well, one, if you read Sun Tzu's Art of War, one of the main concerns is of a opposing, let's say you're in a war, an opposing general, you want to let your enemy think you're very weak or non-existent, because you can get more done that way under the table, behind the scenes, than you can if you present yourself as this strong foe that, run over you. So what happens when Ricci, in fact, who orchestrated his own demise, this is an interesting thing, and there's a court case in Portugal, and it was over a priest who had been found to have stolen a lot of money from the Portuguese banks, and he was up for trial. And it was Lorenzo Ricci himself who came, but instead of defending this priest, he opened up the book on he presented the information to the court on exactly what the Jesuits were all about. I mean, all of their deceitful, underhanded things that they were doing, bribing people, killing people, doing anything possible to take over Portugal and other countries. He brought it out in the court. He didn't have to do that. Now, what did that do? That caused an outrage back then, and was one of the reasons why the Jesuits were disbanded supposedly by the Vatican. But was it an orchestrated effort? Was this a plan? Because why would he do that? And there's a court case that backs that up. So we have Ricci now. The word's getting over to the United States. Hey, because the Protestants, when they came here, they did not want any Jesuits in this country. That's why Catholics couldn't hold office. That's why Jesuits weren't, they were very worried. They didn't want the same thing to happen here that happened in Europe. But when they heard that the Jesuits were no longer existing, maybe they put their guard down. And maybe they didn't realize what they were up against. Because I believe during that period of time they were even stronger. Because they were working clandestinely. It's kind of like the CIA works today, right? And Ricci, instead of dying, and they do this a lot, we can go back to Francis Bacon and all of the, when you go back to the Rosicrucians and all of their fake deaths and all that, they do that today. And one example is, could Bill Hicks still be alive in the persona of Alex Jones? That's just one. But it's not beyond them to do this. And so let's say that Ricci didn't die. And then during that time, to get here, you had to take a ship, so it took a long time. And he comes, and during the Continental Congress and the conventions and the meetings prior to the Constitution being formed, it's documented in several books that there was a man who strikingly resembled Ricci called the Professor that met with Franklin and Jefferson and Washington and all of these people. And did he meet to really set the strategy of what needed to be done? Because if he was the kingpin that created the Revolutionary War, was the mastermind behind it, I believe he was. Because Franklin used to take many, many visits to Europe, and I think he was there to make sure that, to tell the people there that were involved in this conspiracy against this country, even though it seemed as though we were going to be free and the greatest experiment in the world was coming to realization after the Revolutionary War. Could it be he was going there to make sure things were going right and to get his marching orders? And when we look closely at Ricci, some of the documentation says this man, who they called a professor, was even there behind the scenes in the final meetings of the Continental Congress and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and even was instrumental in the formation of the first flag, and et cetera, et cetera. So, if that be the case, then look at how, and to add, look at what really occurs. After the Vatican was given the right to practice religion here, because that's really what the Constitution said, it has grown to be the largest organized religion in this country. But they're really not a religion. I mean, they use that as a cover. But what they really do is they've got, if you look at their bank holdings, if you look at how they're involved in every aspect of your life, you will understand how important Georgetown University is, right next to the Vatican. And there's so many interesting stories when you start tracing this history and how the Vatican became instrumental in what goes on in every aspect of this country, even to the point of how, the statues in our Congress and in the White House and on the Capitol building are representative of the Vatican's intrigue or worshiping of the Greek gods, etc., etc. And such, we have the obelisks, and the three major ones in Rome and in London and in the United States. Isn't that interesting that that obelisk sits out there, and that's supposedly the monument of freedom? Well, what really is, it's a phallic symbol to Isis, worshiping Isis. And isn't it interesting that they chose ISIS as the name of the worldwide terror group that's basically controlled by, again, the Jesuits, as well as the CIA. And we've documented a certain Father Dall'Oglio, who was a very important Jesuit priest in Syria, making sure that the money was getting to the right people so that this terrorist organization could actually function. And if you follow the money, you'll find that it's Western money. So they created the enemy, and why? They create the enemy so they could have a enemy to fight, and then they can then provide you with a solution of protection. We will protect you. We will fight this enemy. And in the meantime, what's happening? The erosion of this country, many, many different ways. And perhaps at the time now, when everybody's looking at that Las Vegas shooting, which was a false flag, as well as all these hurricanes, the eyes off the ball, so to speak. And what are they doing in the background now that you got to be worried about? And I believe a lot has to do with the orchestration of huge wars that are coming about in the near future. We'll be back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal on this, it's October 9, 2017. I think it's President's Day. I really don't care if it's President's Day. And, you know, it reminds me of when I was a kid, they'd say anybody in America can become president. Well, they should have put the little proviso on it that said, that's if you come from royal bloodlines or you're related to Charlemagne. Then you can become president. But anyway, I thought what we could do is, you know, now that I pieced together a little bit on Lorenzo Ricci, which is always hidden from even, I believe, what P.D. Stewart says here, I thought we could, he gives some good information. And so I thought I'd add his information to what I'd given you regarding Lorenzo Ricci and that aspect of the Vatican's basically their orchestration and involvement for reasons that are obvious now. I mean, the Pope comes and speaks to Congress, comes and speaks to the world leaders in the UN. It's not just the representatives of the country. All the world leaders came to us, listen to the big boss, the kingpin, the head snake, who's going to occupy that 666 seat that's empty in the UN. So let's go back to P.D. Stewart, and he talks about how America became a Jesuit enclave. and even talked about the most colossal conspiracy, really, against this United States that's actually playing out right before our very eyes today. And he says, we now come to another highly interesting portion of American history, which would be hard-pressed to find in any of the history books, the part played by the Jesuits in the American Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, 1776, 1783, kind of the war of dependence, if we look at what's really happened in this country. We've seen the role of the Jesuits in the American Civil War, and of course I've talked about that many times, and of course their relation, and their involvement in the killing of President Lincoln. And just one note on that, isn't it interesting, after they were, caught red-handed, putting that assassination against Lincoln, doing it with a hit team of at least 8 people. And when they were caught red-handed doing it, wasn't it interesting that the legislators during that time cut off all diplomatic relations with the Vatican? And that wasn't reinstituted until, guess when? Ronald Reagan's term. But during that period, they were supposedly non-existent here. I think they got more done than they would have if they were, they were given diplomatic, representation. But anyway, we'll go back to that at another time. But what part, if any, did they play in the earlier war that transformed America from a collection of independent states to the United States of America? The uninformed or partisan historians will tell us that this war was mainly, if not entirely, due to the arbitrary and intolerable acts of the British government, leading to the American colonists' desire to break with British rule. Now, remember what I said earlier? That was the front, the cover used by Ricci. He had to figure out a way to pit France against America in the States, and to create this third-party role of the patriot, to basically let everyone think it was basically because of British rule, the British rule here, as well as, extra high tariffs, things like that. But, if you go back and you look, and I've read a couple of books on this, most of the colonists didn't want to break away from England. It was a very few. And it was the kind of like the way it is, today, in a sense. A few people can determine the outcome of many. And if we look back during that time, many of the colonists were quite happy with the way life was here. And all it took was the instigation of a certain, let's call them rebels, to instigate this war, which they've done in many other wars. So it got the ball rolling, so to speak. That snowball I always talk about, that you start pushing it down a hill with a strategy, it starts gaining momentum and size and power. And that's exactly what Ricci was a mastermind at doing. So to the uninformed, historians will tell you that it was entirely intolerable acts by the British government. But that's really not the case. But what about religion playing a major role in the American Revolution? It's beyond dispute if you really look at it. In 1776, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, and since this is President's Day, I think it's a good day to talk about it, there were a little over 23 priests in all. And the next highest authority was the Vicar Apostolic in London, who had jurisdiction over the British colonies and satellites in America. The American Revolutionary War of Independence soon changed all that. You see, there was only that one little archdiocese here in Maryland. Only 23 priests were in this country, and that was because the Protestants didn't want them here. So guess what happens? Once you open up the door to freedom of religion, guess who can come in? What's the largest religious organization in our country now? I think you know who it is. Now, the reason there were few Catholics back then, and so many more Protestants, was because of the foundation of the great democracy that is today called the United States of America was laid when millions of European Protestants fled the oppression of the Catholic Church in Europe to seek freedom of conscience and religion in the most uninhabited wilderness of North America. In the main, the settlers were resolved not to duplicate, and I was saying this in the first half hour, duplicate in the New World what they had fled from in the Old one. these settlers felt that the Pope, as a foreign ruler, they should not be allowed to meddle in the politics or laws of America. Now, who said that recently? Well, if you think 1960 is recent, it was John F. Kennedy. He said the same exact thing, and he was a card-carrying Catholic. And he actually told us, he said, listen, no papal power will rule this country. And then he gave his secret society speech, and then not more than 3 months later, he was dead. Now, these settlers felt that the Pope as a foreign ruler should not be allowed to meddle in the politics or laws of America, as they suspected that would render it difficult for immigrants, especially Catholics, to be fully loyal to a new country and to its fledgling Republican values. Now, naturally, there was a fear of Roman Catholics, not unlike the fear many Americans today have of Muslim fundamentalists. Now, what about the story, did you ever listen to my shows and follow other researchers who talk about how the Vatican created Islam? They're masters at creating religions. They do it all the time. Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, what else? You can keep going, and I'm sure, remember I was going to have that contest once? Let's create a new religion. And can you create? I'm always thinking, what could be a new one? I mean, can I do better than what the Vatican has done? And nobody joined my contest. It's like calling a party and nobody comes. I was upset. Remember my iPet Go 2 contest? And only 2 people signed up? And the reason they did is because I put on a $25 entry fee, and you were going to analyze iPet Go 2. And guess what? Only 2 people signed up. And that's because I have a cheap audience. They don't like to send money. But anyway, I do the show anyway. Okay? Now, if I would have done a 0 entry fee, I would have had 100 people start calling. But guess who would have had to read it? Me. So I figured, hey, if I'm going to read all this stuff, just send me $25 so I can keep the show going. But anyway, 2 people did send it in, and thank you for that. And I promise, remember I said the top 2 winners are going to get their, I'm going to have to interview them on the radio show? Well, there were only 2, and so one of them contacted me and said, you better put me on my show. I said, I will, so I'm going to get him on next week. And if you're listening, send me another email so I don't have to go through all the emails again and look for you. But anyway, I was very saddened over iPet Go 2 because, like I said, it's like throwing a party and nobody comes. But anyway, I digress. I'm in a serious mood today, by the way. That's why I'm not just rambling on like I usually do, making you laugh every now and then. But, like I always say, every day you should laugh once, cry once, and then go to sleep. Okay. I have not cried yet today. I've been laughing a lot. But I will think of something to cry over as soon as I get off the show. Okay. Now, naturally, like I said, there's fear of these Roman Catholics back then. Because the Protestants, they knew what they were about. Remember when they tried to blow up Parliament? And they were caught? Luckily, before it happened. After all, these early Protestant pilgrims had recently escaped the hands of their Catholic compatriots. In those days, people took their Catholicism seriously. So much so that several states passed laws regulating the activities of Roman Catholics. For example, in 1647, a Massachusetts statute declared that every priest was an, quote, incendiary and disturber of the public peace and safety, and an enemy of true Christian values. The early American settlers suspected that the Pope was seeking to meddle in the affairs of the United States. Well, don't you think he's meddled into the affairs of the United States? Look at over the years. Now, to undermine its Republican values, which they said was evidenced by the oath that every Catholic bishop was required to take. I will, to the utmost of my power, see out and oppose schismatics, heretics, and the enemies of our sovereign Lord, the Pope, and his successors. However, the period following the restoration of the Jesuits in 1814 saw tremendous growth in their numbers and influence in America, as evidenced by the large number of Jesuit colleges and universities established on that continent in the century 22 of the Society's 28 universities today. In those days, says historian Rene Fulop Miller, one of Benjamin Franklin's friends was a Jesuit. This, of course, talked about in the past was John Carroll, who had been brought up in Maryland of Irish parentage. He would later become the Archbishop of Baltimore and go on to establish the Jesuit University of what? Georgetown, in a suburb of the city of Washington, the federal capital, the first Catholic educational institution in the United States. According to Robert Emmett Curran, in his bicentennial history of Georgetown University, the Society of Jesus, quote, resolved in 1786 to found Georgetown to supply for Catholics the new republic, the clergy whom the society had provided previously. John Carroll was born in 1735 at Upper Marlboro, Maryland. After receiving a Jesuit education at Bohemia in Cecil County, Maryland, Carroll studied abroad at Jesuit colleges and universities in Europe. He was forced to flee Europe when the Jesuits were expelled from Sweden under the decree of Pope Clement in 1773, and on August 15, 1790, Reverend Carroll was appointed the first Catholic bishop in the United States, the only one of America, being consecrated on the Feast of the Assumption. At the time, the papacy not only had to deal with the concerns of Americans that these revolutionary priests, Jesuits, outcasts were migrating to America, it also had to quell the fears of the American people that the Catholic Church in America was itself no more than a Trojan horse for the installation of a foreign ruler, the Pope. And isn't it, just think back, what was it, 2015 or whenever he came here and spoke to Congress? I mean, that is unheard of in the old days as well, and then going to the UN and talking to the leaders of the world. And what about when all these presidents, you ever notice since Kennedy, they all go flocking to Rome. And if you ever watch where they meet under the picture of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order. Now we got a Jesuit Pope, we got a Jesuit Black Pope, which is the Jesuit General. And like I said, all roads lead to Borgo Santo Spirito Cinque, and that's right in downtown Rome. The head of the Jesuit order there. Probably more important than the Vatican itself. So anyway, we got this, the people thinking, hey, this has got to be just a Trojan horse when the Catholics start arriving here. And to overcome these suspicions, Jesuit John Carroll advised the Pope to have the portion of the oath which required allegiance to the Pope above all others. You see, that's what these people do. They are allegiance, the leaders of your country, including the top congressmen and senators, do not have allegiance first to the United States. They have allegiance to the Pope in Rome. And you say, well, how can they if they're not Catholic? Well, you don't have to be a card-carrying Catholic to have allegiance to Pontifex Maximus. Advise the Pope to have that portion of the oath, which says, I got to give you top allegiance above all others, removed from the American bishop's pledge. This was done to avoid giving offense to the principles of the Constitution and to calm the fears that the Catholic bishops were merely puppets of the Pope on American soil. Well, they are. And remember we talked about, remember when Ratzinger, before he was Pope, and now he's hiding away. I was just doing an interview with somebody in Rome, and he's very ill. He lives back somewhere in the Vatican, still important to their plans. He used to be the head of the Office of Inquisition, which still exists today. They give it a different name. It's called the Congregation of Faith and the Apostolic blah, blah, blah. But the Office of the Inquisition is now run by a bishop in San Francisco, the first time in the history of the Office of the Inquisition that it's been in America. And for good reason. That's where the next one's going to be. So the Masonic Review of 1893 goes as far as to state that the Freemasonry was the driving force in the formation of the American Union in 1776, claiming that at least 52 out of the 56 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence as members of the Lodge. Charles Carroll, John Carroll's cousin, was a signer. By encouraging Britain to effect into legislation in a series of unreasonable and intolerable acts, the name given by the American patriots to 5 laws adopted by the Parliament in 1774, the secret operatives helped create a state of deep, deep resentment and rebellion in the hearts of the American colonists. One such intolerable act was a new government tax scheme on imports of tea. This was what happened behind the scenes. Two Scottish Rite Freemasons, Paul Revere and another Masonic brother, Joseph Warren, one of the George Washington generals, were members of the oldest lodge in America, St. Andrew's in Boston. George Washington himself was initiated into Fredericksburg Lodge in 1752. Now, we all know, when you do some deep study, that the Jesuits created, in a sense, Freemasonry and worked to get, even though they publicly state they abhor Freemasonry, they are involved in it hook, line, and sinker. Now, remember, when I was in Italy, there was huge stories that came out in the French and the Italian newspapers. And this was during the time of John Paul II. No, wait, it was John Paul I, before he was killed, that over 150 cardinals and bishops were outed as being card-carrying members of the P2 Masonic Lodge, which if you look at Vatican law, if you look at canon law, that is supposed to be an excommunicatable offense. You're out. But none of them were out. The only one that was out was when they killed the guy who came up with wanted to clean house, and that was John Paul I. And even Cardinal Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, was named as a card-carrying member of a Masonic lodge. And his code name was Papa Bear or something like that. Because he was a big guy, about 6'4", about 270. But anyway, we've talked about Marcinkus many times. So they go with this, we're back in, talking about the connections of our founding fathers. And I say a long time ago that the real founding fathers need to come forward and take credit for what they've done. And that's Lorenzo Ricci and a number of other Jesuit priests who really were behind this whole thing. But, being the kind of people they are, they just don't want you to know who they are. But anyway, next to the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, considered by the American colonists to be another intolerable act. But by far the worst and most notable of these intolerable acts was the Quebec Act, passed on May 20th, 1774. It received the royal accent on June 22nd, 1774, which attempted to cede all of the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains and north the Ohio River to Canada, which at the time was basically essential, very, very important. It was essentially a Catholic Quebec. In particular, the legislation purported to extend the Catholic province of Quebec south and west to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers and into western colonies of the Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia, taking land that many Protestant colonists had already claimed. That this was a deliberately provocative act, the legislative extension of the province of Quebec into so large an area of what was to become United States is seen from the fact that Quebec's Canada, the largest province, is 3 times the size of France and 7 times the size of Great Britain. Thus, the Catholics of Quebec had more than ample land to expand within Quebec, plus the vast expanse that is Canada. Further and curiously, the Quebec Act of 1774 established Catholicism as the official religion in what was at the time the British colony of Canada. And in conformity with the practice in Catholic countries of the day, it provided for trials without a jury, denied representative assembly, the simultaneous passage of the Quebec Act and the coercive acts by the British Parliament led the colonists to angrily declare that the Quebec Act an immoral pact between Britain and the Popery. What is surprising about this is that the British, who were supposed to be Protestants, included a provision in the Act expressly providing for Canada to remain under the exclusive control of the Roman Catholic religion. And this provision was to apply to the newly ceded territory, i.e. all of the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River. So you don't think they had an involvement here? The terms excluded that stipulation that the exercise of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion shall be maintained. This was most curious, coming from a supposedly Protestant power. The British American colonists, mostly Protestants, were naturally outraged, declaring the law to be one of the most intolerable acts of the British Parliament. Historian Martin Griffin writes that it caused a good deal of patriotic indignation and was widely considered by people on both sides of the Atlantic to have contributed in no small part to the Revolutionary War of 1776. See how Ricci's hand is moving here? The American colonists lambasted the Quebec Act, denouncing it and the attendant French alliance as a dagger aimed at the heart, as a betrayal of their religious heritage and a Trojan horse. So Ricci is now pushing that snowball down that mountain, that snowball, that revolutionary snowball that's going to create this war that they need to have in order to get into this country. And they did, big time. The colonists issued an address written to the people of England in which they expressed an astonishment that the British Parliament should ever consent to establish in that country, Canada, a religion that has deluged the island of England in blood, dispersed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion throughout every part of the world. So why does Britain allow that? Because the Vatican still had control under King George, I contend. Indeed, we have to question and regard as very suspicious, indeed, the eagerness shown by a Protestant King George to thus favor the Catholic faith in one of its Protestant colonies, was so gracious a grant of American territory to Roman Catholics. I got to end it there because we're running out of time. But, my whole point of the show was to say that the whole idea of what we're told in the history books about the Revolutionary War and the formation in this country is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. There's a story way, way more important to understand, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, of how the Vatican and Jesuit order instigated the Revolutionary War for a reason and created this country for a reason. And that was so they could get control of it in the end. And once they get control, you have no freedom of religion at all. Okay, we'll be back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal. Thanks for listening, and see you tomorrow.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.